Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us to Broward Cultural Division's Business Skills for Creatives. I'm your host this week, Joshua Wida, a local art and business attorney down here in Fort Lauderdale. Business Skills for Creatives is a continuation of Broward Cultural Division's award-winning 2020 series, which allowed artists and creatives to develop their art, bring it to life during the pandemic, and also build their business skills as well. So this is a continuation of that series through 2021. This is the final session of the English portion of the series. However, on August 21st, Broward Cultural Division will be offering a special edition of this series, the Business Skills series, in Spanish. So you can check the comments for a link to register for that session. You can tell people about it, refer a friend. We got a great session today, but before we get started, we have a few housekeeping items. As a reminder, this is recorded. So if you watch it and feel like you missed some information, you can always go back and rewatch it again. Closed captioning is available. It's available on YouTube and Facebook. No, we have found that the closed captioning seems to be stronger on Facebook. So feel free to sign off and go check on Facebook if that is something you are interested in. And finally, we will be taking questions throughout the session, so please feel free to type them into the chat. As an art and business attorney down here, I'm really excited for this session. This is the art of the negotiation, which is not something a lot of creatives think that they need, because they view themselves purely as artists. But as we've seen during the pandemic and through these other skill sessions, it's important to develop business skills, and negotiations are very important. So we have a wonderful speaker today, Jessica Lee. She's a partner in the Advanced Media and Technology Department at Loeb and Loeb in New York City. She helps companies launch, market, and monetize digital products, and she advises on a number of areas, including artificial intelligence, virtual reality, artificial reality, and other emerging technologies. She was named one of Crain's notable women in law for 2019. Jessica also contributes her time to several community service projects and mentorship initiatives. So welcome today, Jessica Lee. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited for this too.
Me too. I'm really excited for your presentation. You got some great slides, some great information in store for us today.
Yeah, I think I do too. And I agree. I think, creatives probably don't think of themselves as being negotiators, but you have to be able to stand up for yourself and fight for your rights. And, we'll say fight softly, but advocate for yourself. Maybe that's a better way to put it.
Speak softly, but carry a big stick, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I think with that, if you're ready to get started, feel free.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming today. Like I said, I'm excited for this session. We have a lot to cover. Just want to go into a little bit of what you should expect for today. I want to cover some key agreement terms just so we know what we're talking about. I'm going to hope that in many cases, if you're working with a gallery, a studio, a company, you're licensing, we'll talk about some of these different terms, but that you will have an agreement in place. But even if you don't, just to talk about some of the key concepts that might be important for you to discuss before you enter into any business partnership with another person. And then we're going to get into the negotiation strategies. So what is negotiation? What tips can you have? I think it sounds very ominous, and the idea of having to kind of walk into a room and ask for something, not know how much you can ask for or how you should be thinking about it. What I'm hoping you'll walk away from today's session with are some tools so that anytime you walk into one of these situations, you're equipped with what you need to do, kind of the analysis, the preparation in the beginning, which we'll talk about, so that you can walk out of any relationship with the best possible outcome. And then we'll give some tips for getting to that win-win, which means both parties are happy. And we'll do a couple of practice sessions just so you have a sense of what this might look like in real life. So if we go to the next slide, like I said, I wanted to start off with some key contract points. Now, I look at these things for a living. I know, the text is, sometimes in some version of Latin. It's sometimes very dense and complicated, but we can always drill this down into plain English. So we're talking about a contract. The key provisions really could boil down to who has to do what, for how long, who owns what, how and when will I be paid, and then what happens when things go wrong. And we can point to those sections, but I think when you're looking at a contract or even when you're just sort of looking at a proposal, these are really the key items that you want to drill down on and make sure you have this covered somewhere. If it's not covered, you want to make sure it's covered, because these are all the kind of important terms you want to have in place. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to kind of break these down. So if we're talking about who has to do what, that might show up in an agreement in a section called, it might be obligations, it might be scope of work. You might be talking about project information, performance. I can't predict all of the potential iterations for how this shows up, but those are usually some of the terms that will be the section that describes who has to do what. So if we're boiling this down, exactly what are your obligations? Are you supposed to deliver a certain number of pieces of art? Do you have to have them printed, on a certain type of material? Do you have timing obligations? What are their obligations? Are they obligated to do a certain level of advertising and marketing for you? Are they obligated to secure any rights for you, to secure any spaces? This is obviously, I took a look in advance. I know we have artists across a number of different mediums, so the exact specifics are going to vary based on what you're doing, but really drilling down to what are your obligations and what are their obligations. And again, these are just some questions, and I believe you'll have access to this excuse me. I believe you'll have access to this. So, hopefully you can use this as a little checklist when you're going into a partnership. But think about what exactly you're being asked to create when you're on the creator side. What are the timelines? I think I mentioned earlier, are they going to market your work for you? I think that's a critical aspect of any partnership you're going into. So if you're going to put this effort in, what are you getting back? Is that in terms of marketing? Obviously, we know payment, but marketing space, elevating your profile. Is there, a commitment to actually include your work in a show, for example? If it's a license, which we'll get into some of the licensing details later, what's the scope? Is it exclusive? And if it is exclusive, what are the ramifications of that? Is it just exclusive to certain pieces of work? How long is that exclusivity? And how does that impact you? And then are there restrictions on your activities during the licensing term? And like I said, we'll unpack specifically some of these pieces about a license later in the presentation. But this is just to give you a sense of some of the questions you should be asking yourself about who has to do what. So if we go to the next slide, then for how long? What is a term? This shows up. It's usually a term or termination period in an agreement. So how long is this relationship going to last? And then how do you get out of it? Is there a set time? Do certain things have to happen? Are there performance benchmarks? Are there options to extend the term if you want to extend the term? Is it going to be automatic? Is action required? I know for me when I'm working with clients, if I see any kind of automatic extension, we have to have a conversation about that, because typically you sign these agreements and everyone goes off to their lives. And if the license is going to automatically renew, you have to have some way of reminding yourself about that, because if you want to get out of it, you don't want this to roll over and you're in the next license term, without having an opportunity to end it if that's what you were looking to do. And are there restrictions on termination? So again, this is just sort of like a mini checklist of questions for you to be asking yourself if you're looking at an agreement or a proposal, or just having a conversation with a partner. So if we go to the next slide, I think what ends up being key, and which I'm going to spend a little bit of time on just so we have some additional context on what we're talking about, but intellectual property. And this comes up in terms of who owns what. So first of all, if we're talking about our intellectual property, we have to understand, well, what is it? This breaks down into 4 categories, even though I'm going to focus more on copyright down the line. But when we're talking about intellectual property, we're talking potentially about trademarks. So trademarks are your branding. It identifies a source or origin. So like the Gap is obviously a trademark. You can think about labels on clothes; those designate a trademark. You have to have an item sort of out in the world being sold to justify getting a trademark attached to it. So you may or may not be talking about trademarks when you're talking about intellectual property. You also have patents. These are, could be inventions, industrial design, copyright, which I think for this group is probably the most relevant. These are original works of authorship, whether that is, writing, a piece of art, sculpture, that could all potentially fall into copyright. And then right of publicity, which may also be important and which you might not be thinking about, which is you, right? It's your name, it's your likeness, to the extent that you have name recognition and notoriety, or even if you don't, if your image is being included in any type of recording that's going to be used for a commercial purpose, you have a right to publicity, you have a right to control how your name and your image is being used. So when we talk about intellectual property, we should be thinking about, well, what is being included here? So am I trying to license a trademark to my work, or am I talking about copyright to my original authorship? Am I myself going to be appearing somewhere, so it's my right of publicity? And make sure sort of all of these things are covered off. But if we go into the next slide, like I said, I think copyright is going to end up for this group being the most important. So I did want to spend some time here. So in terms of copyright, what works are protected? Typically we're talking about literary works, musical works. That should be obvious. Literary works are plays, books, other pieces of material, written authorship. Musical works or music. Dramatic works could be a play, for example. Even pantomime and some choreography could fall into copyright. Architectural works can be protected by copyright as well. motion pictures, audiovisual works, sound recordings. There's a separate statute actually that deals with visual rights and visual artists. But for copyright, this is typically the bucket of work that we're talking about here. And if you go to the next slide, we can break those down. We think about copyright as a bundle of rights. So copyright owners have some exclusive rights to reproduction. That just means making copies. Derivative works, which might mean making a variation, right? So taking a work and doing a reboot, for example. We're in the age of a ton of reboots, at least in the film and TV world. So that is one way to do a derivative work. Distribution, so being able to put something out in the world. Public display and public performance, so having it out for public view, and then a digital audio performance. And so if in the event that you're negotiating rights or a license to your copyright, you have this bundle of rights and you can think about what you're willing to offer. Are you only giving the right to reproduce? Are you only giving the right for distribution or public performance? Is it some combination? And particularly when we're talking about exclusivity, can you narrow that to the extent you want to only be, an exclusive right for public performance, as an example, or an exclusive right for public display, not giving away an exclusive right for reproduction, or not giving away the exclusive right for derivative works. If you're thinking of, from the artist standpoint, you want to reserve as many of these rights for yourself as possible so that you can use them in other places. So to the extent someone is looking to get rights to your copyrighted piece of material, you really want to understand what is it specifically that they're looking to do, and what rights do you need to give up? Will that be exclusive? And kind of go through this bundle of rights when we're thinking about that analysis. So if we go to the next slide, I can show you a little bit about what is not protected by copyright. And copyright, requires something to be reduced to a fixed medium. So ideas generally are not copyright. So I had a great idea, and then I see it out in the world somewhere. There have been plenty of lawsuits with examples of someone trying to sue over an idea they had, but if you didn't derive it, to actual written form, it's really hard to protect those rights. Works that aren't fixed. So I mentioned, choreography earlier, but that choreography has to be kind of in, kind of in a physical form. So it has to be either notated, so you have, kind of step by step of what that choreography is. It has to be recorded. If it was a speech, it has to be transcribed later and written down. It can't be sort of ephemeral, or else it's hard to get protection for it. And then mere variations. So something that just has a different sort of coloring or lettering, it's going to be very hard to get copyright for that. It really has to be, they look at that, the original work of authorship is important there. And then generally titles, names, short phrases, slogans, those are generally not protected by copyright. Depending on how they're being used, that might be your trademark, that might be your brand. If you think about, Nike, just do it, that's not protected by copyright. That's Nike's trademark. So again, it's important to think about what we're talking about here. And then, just as an example, which I think is interesting, just listings of ingredients or contents, for example, are not protected by copyright. So if you think of, I cook, particularly during the pandemic, you go to a blog with a recipe and you have to kind of scroll down to the end to get to the actual recipe. Well, that's because what's protected by copyright is the narrative text about the story of the recipe. The specific ingredients and the steps to cook, those are not actually protected by copyright, which is why you see a lot more material around some of those posts. So it's important to understand kind of what the scope is when we're talking about copyright. So if we go into the next slide, I wanted to kind of give a little bit of context for some of those rights and intellectual property. We could have a whole other session kind of getting into the weeds of intellectual property and intellectual property law. We do want to focus on the negotiation here, but that's just, wanted to have a little bit of knowledge in your back pocket, as we're talking about some of these concepts that would be negotiated. So intellectual property is important because it comes into that question of who owns what. So is it a work for hire? A work for hire is a situation where you're being hired to create something. Whoever is hiring you to create that thing will own that work, right? So you're creating it for them. They'll have complete ownership rights. If it's something that you've created yourself, that someone's interested in, then it might be a license agreement. If it's not just a pure sale. If we're talking about license, kind of go back to what I said earlier, what of those bundle of rights are you giving up? Reproduction, distribution, etc. And then what is the term? And then also what is the territory? Are we talking about the US? Is this international? Is it global? If we're talking about, a digital work, obviously that's typically worldwide, but just thinking about what exact rights are you giving up? And then if it's a sale, are there restrictions on resale that you'd like to put in place? I know increasingly in the last couple of years, gallerists and artists are looking to put resale restrictions on works of art. And so thinking about, is that something that's important to you? And, I do want to say, and we'll get into this when we get into some of the negotiation strategies, is that all of this is only important to the extent that it is important to you. And so a lot of this is going to require you to think in advance, what's the best way for me to protect my work? What are my goals? What do I want to see for myself? And how can I make sure that the deals that I'm negotiating and the partnerships that I'm getting into serve those goals? And so thinking about what you want to hold for yourself down the line, what you're willing to give up, all of this is kind of the softer side of what goes into negotiating and thinking about, what do I want to try to achieve for myself? So if we get to the next slide, crucial, we don't want to leave out, pay me what you owe me. You want to understand, obviously, what the payment, this might come up, it'll say payment, compensation, fee. That part should be pretty self-explanatory, but just understanding how much will be paid. Are there conditions for payment? Do you have to meet certain performance benchmarks in order to be paid? Or are there other conditions in terms of, delivery, et cetera, that have to be met? How will you be paid? And then when will you be paid? Are you getting paid in advance? Is there any possibility to get some portion of your payment in advance, or will you be paid sort of at the end? If we're talking about a show, is at the end of the show? Just again, the specifics of this are really going to depend on what we're talking about, but these are all of the questions that I hope we'll be asking ourselves when we're thinking about what payment structure looks like. The actual number is obviously very important and coming to a number that works for you, but you want to make sure you actually get paid in the time that you want to get paid, and that payment isn't, unnecessarily restricted by conditions that are put on it. So while the number is important, we want to look at all these other payment details as well. And if we can go to the next slide, of course, we have to talk about what happens when things go wrong. So these are a couple of sections. Again, this gets into like the very boilerplate legalese. This is a part of the contract that no one wants to look at. Sometimes these sections are in all caps. It's very dense. But these are the important sections because this goes into what happens when things go wrong, what protections are in place on both sides. So I do want to break some of this down because I know, if you're not used to looking at this every single day, it might be a little bit odd for you. But typically what you'll see in an agreement is indemnification. So indemnification is when you're being compensated for loss. It's basically security against liability. It'll say something like, if my work gets damaged, while it's in your gallery, you'll compensate me for that. Or if I didn't get all of the rights to my material and I license it out to you, and then you're sued by a third party for infringing on their intellectual property, I will cover those costs for you. So it's basically shifting the risk based off of who might be responsible when something goes wrong. But of course, you want there to be caps on that. That's what a limitation of liability is. So that's a cap on the damage that someone might face. So if you are, looking at an agreement where you do have some liability, you might be at risk for having to indemnify the other side, you want there to be a cap on that. And that cap is obviously going to depend on what you have, maybe what your insurance policy provides. There are a lot of things that go into that, but that's what that limitation of liabilities is. You'll also typically see a representations and warranties section. So representations just means this is a statement of facts that encourages a party to enter into a contract. And then if it you find out that that's been violated, if those representations were wrong, the entire contract can be voided. It's typically looked at as a material breach of the contract. And so representation might be, I have all of the rights required for me to, hand this work off to you. That's one just example of what a representation might look like. And a warranty is a promise, which if broken, then can be compensated for. So a warranty might mean, I will not license this out to another party or to a competitor, for example, during the term of our agreement. That's just an example potentially of what you might see in terms of representations and warranties. And then we talked a little bit about the term and termination before, but to the extent that there's a right to terminate because something has gone wrong, are you allowed a notice or a cure period? And that's something that might be helpful to have in an agreement. If you don't want the other party to be able to get out quickly, will they have an obligation to at least give you notice that you've violated some aspect of the contract or that there's an issue, and will they give you a period to cure that before the agreement gets terminated? So again, these are sections of an agreement. I think that most probably don't. I mean, some of the lawyers don't even want to read this. But I do encourage that if you do get this, if you don't have legal representation, you should try to kind of dig in to see what exactly is being asked of you and what are you taking on, because a lot of what goes wrong is resolved by what happens in these sections of an agreement. Okay, so with that, I think we can turn to licensing. Again, before we get into the nitty gritty on some of the negotiation strategies, I wanted to give some additional context. And I think licensing is a good example that will lay some foundation for how we strategize and how we negotiate. So if we go to the next slide, licensing is just generally a way to give another party the rights to use your work. It doesn't transfer ownership, so you get to retain ownership, but it just gives them a right to use it, usually for a temporary period of time. So if we go to the next slide, we can look at exclusive versus non-exclusive licenses. So exclusive licenses obviously gives whoever you're giving that right to the sole right to use your work. Importantly, this means that you may also be excluded from using your own work. This might be an old reference at this point, but if anyone was a fan of Seinfeld, there was an episode where Kramer licensed the right to his life stories to a publisher Elaine was working for. And, he got money for it. He thought it was very exciting. And then, flash forward, he's in a bar and he's telling a story, which is what he, would always do. And Elaine came over and said, well, you can't tell that story anymore. That's not your story anymore. You've licensed the rights to that story out to Mr. Peterman. So silly example. I feel like we're going to get to a point where maybe Seinfeld isn't the reference I can use anymore. But if anyone is familiar with that series, that's just an example of what the restrictions might look for on an exclusive license. So if you're giving out an exclusive license, that kind of goes to what I was saying before. Can you narrow that as much as possible? Or think about if you need to retain any rights for your own personal use. Non-exclusive license, on the other hand, gives someone the right to use your work, but you're free to give other people that right as well. This is a non-exclusive license for the same copyrighted work. That means multiple people could potentially have the right to use that. So one example is if you go to one of the stock photo sites, that is usually a non-exclusive license. Multiple people could use that photo if they would like to. So really important to understand, are we in exclusive license world or are we in non-exclusive license world? Okay, if we go to the next slide, what should you negotiate? Do you have any rights to negotiate here? And the answer is, of course, yes, you do. There are a couple of things. So if we go to the next slide, first, fees. Fees for a license might come up in the context of a lump sum. It could be a recurring fee. It could be a royalty. So a royalty is a payment made for ongoing use so that someone can continue to get revenue over time. This comes up for artists, but this also comes up in the context of motion pictures or TV. You get royalties for your performance that gets extended over a period of time. That might work for you. Again, what you want to negotiate is depending on the medium you're working in and what you think your best options are. For some, that potential for royalties might have a higher return than getting a lump sum. But, just wanted to go through, these are just some of the things that you might think about negotiating. If it is a lump sum, trying to get to a number that works for you. If we go to the next slide, another thing to negotiate in the context of a license is the scope of that license. And that means what territories we're talking about. And territories is just the location. So is it lawyers will write these contracts and it'll be in all mediums worldwide, it'll be perpetual. So that's sort of like the broadest license possible. It covers every possible area and medium for all of time. That might not be the full scope of what you're looking for from a licensing agreement. You might want to narrow that scope, right? So I've worked with some who say, well, look, I'll give you the right to use this in the US, but I want to reserve the right to use this outside of the US. So there's certain countries where I have relationships with, and I want to make sure that I can exploit my work there, but I'll give you the right here. You can use it in, digital form, but I'm going to keep, the work in a different form for myself. I'm going to give you some rights, maybe reproduction, or I'll give a right for public display, but I'm going to reserve other rights for myself. So really understanding the full scope, not just sort of allowing anything and everything across the board, will at least help you reserve some of these rights for yourself. So past scope, if we go to the next slide, we can look at some of the rights. Are we talking about performance, display? What do you want to reserve? This kind of picks up from what I was talking about on the last slide. What do you want to reserve for yourself for you to be able to exploit? Are there certain mediums, certain territories, or certain buckets of rights? And this is helpful to have. We'll talk about preparation for negotiations shortly, but this is something important for you to have kind of going into, I would call it maybe a year, going into a big project, trying to think about long-term, what you want to see for yourself. My fear is that in some cases, things are, you get an opportunity, it lands in front of you, you have to act very quickly, but we're not thinking about kind of like the long-term implications of some of these opportunities. And so it's good just to have a general philosophy for yourself about what you want, kind of what your long-term strategy is, and all of that should get built into what you're willing to let go in terms of these licensing rights. So if we go to the next slide, term, obviously, what is a term? If you're giving an exclusive license, you might be able to, if you're not able to minimize the territories or the medium, you might just be able to minimize the term. So you can have an exclusive right to this for a 2-year window, a 1-year window, a 5-year window. You can figure out what that window makes sense, but you can narrow the scope of that exclusive license that way. Think about if there are, putting aside the licensing scenario, also think about performance benchmarks. Are there options to extend the term on either side? If this is something that you want to extend, think about maybe, a relationship with a gallery or a studio, for example. Are there options to extend those terms, and are there performance benchmarks associated with that? We talked a little bit earlier about that. Is it automatic, or is there going to be actual action required? And thinking about what that looks like, and for yourself to be able to monitor and stay on top of that. And then are there restrictions on that termination? And just the last point, because I said this before and I want to say it again, what happens if things go wrong? I'm not going to go through the details, but when we're talking about what you should negotiate, you want to negotiate these sections, what we think of as the boilerplate sections. You want to be able to negotiate the scope of indemnification, negotiate any cap on liability, and negotiate what you're willing to represent and warrant in an agreement. So I think we're going to take maybe a break for questions here before we jump into the meat of this, the negotiation strategies.
All right, Jessica, great first part of the presentation. Some questions have been asked, and one that came to my mind is, we were discussing licensing, non-exclusive versus exclusive, royalties, and you went through it pretty well, but in your opinion, how would an artist develop their own strategy in terms of whether their normal procedure should be an exclusive versus a non-exclusive, right? So maybe, I guess let's use a photographer as an example. Should they make it a non-exclusive? Is there different things that they can focus on a case-by-case scenario?
Sure. And I mean, some of that is going to depend on the type of photographer. Like if you're creating work for kind of mass market use, right? You want it to be able to be widely distributed, then I would say you want that to be a non-exclusive license because you want those images to be used in as many places and as many times as possible. If you're more sort of like a fine art photographer, right, or you're doing something that you want to be used in a more limited form, then you might think about, or you might be more open to an exclusive license. Again, going back into what I said before, though, limiting the term. So maybe you're open to the exclusive license, but it's for a year. Maybe it's not even a year. Maybe it's 6 months, depending on what the project is. But can you narrow that exclusive license down? So some of that is going to depend on what your goals are for how you want your work to go out into the world.
And would you say it's beneficial to maybe be open to flexibility? So not necessarily always doing an exclusive license, even if you are a fine art photographer, for example?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think you always want to be flexible. I think you just need to understand what your goals are and make sure whatever you're doing aligns with those goals, right? So that you're not making decisions that are going to hurt you in the long run, or you're not going to have access to your work, for a period of time because you just jumped at the opportunity to give an exclusive license out to someone.
Great. Now, a question that we had asked via Facebook dealt with musicians, and it dealt with learning how to negotiate for certain terms. So I know we're going through the prelude, so to speak, of the meat in terms of a negotiation process. Any tips and strategies may be directed, using musicians as an example, as to how a person can think of their own goals, how to come up with those goals instead of, maybe they don't know how to figure that out for themselves.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, some of this is, and if we take the example of a musician for in particular, I would try to paint my goal picture, right? Call it, I don't know, 3 years from now, whatever it is, where ideally would I be, like, moonshot, like what does that look like for myself? And then sort of what steps do I need to take in order to be able to get there? Do I need to have a deal with, a certain type of label? Am I going to go direct out to myself on one of the platforms? Am I going to try to negotiate independently, with a Spotify, for example? What do my different paths look like? Do I need to have certain performances, or do I need to be in front of certain audiences? And I think then you can take those things and use that for your negotiation, because we'll get into this a little bit, but part of the negotiation is understanding what your alternatives are. And so when you walk into a room, you want to understand, well, if this doesn't work out, what's my best alternative for something else? And I think if you have a little bit of what you have mapped out for you, you'll have a better sense of, should I take this because this is my best option, or do I actually have another alternative kind of set up for myself? So some of that kind of career planning, which I feel like we probably don't say that often in the creative space, but some of that career planning is important because that helps you go into a room and understand what you're willing to take or not.
And to your point, I think it's one of those things that a lot of artists might hear career planning and think, well, I don't know what my art's going to be in 10 years. So how can I plan that? But I think what you're really saying here, just to say it another way, is that it's not necessarily the content of the art. It's your career path, right? Where do you as an individual want to be on this journey of a creative career, for lack of a better word?
Right. And I mean, and any plan should be revisited, right? Like nothing should be kind of written in stone. And I think I told people I wanted to be a marine biologist when I was, in high school. I don't even know if I knew what that meant, but I thought it sounded cool. Like, you're always changing. So you have to give, when I say plan, I mean plan and then constantly revisit as things change and your priorities change, but just have a sense of where you're going, I think. And I think that will help in terms of deciding what you're willing to negotiate.
I just want to emphasize that for people. That is such brilliant advice. Always be flexible in your goals, right? And then we have one final question that we might get into a little bit more as we go along, but it's a good prelude. I'm interested in how you negotiate and or measure the quality of marketing and partnerships. Reasonableness, right? Is that where we're going with this?
Right. Yeah, no, definitely. Oh, I see. Too often it will market for you. Yep. I've definitely seen this. And I would say that you want to get into specifics of marketing, right? So if we're talking about marketing, is there a dollar figure that's going to be attached to how much they're willing to spend for you? If we're talking about social media, then is there a number of social media posts, for example, that will be required? And what does the content of those posts look like? Is it some silly tweets? Or are you going to require production and reels? If we're talking about Instagram, are we talking about multiple platforms? Can you get a guarantee of the number of platforms that they're willing to post on? And then can you get a sense of what their reach is? So if we are talking about the digital context, what is the reach of each of their platforms? And can they give either guarantees or benchmarks about how many views those posts will get? I prefer to start with a dollar being attached to marketing efforts. That way you kind of know, okay, this is how much money someone's actually willing to put behind an effort. But in addition to that, I would also go into the specifics of what the marketing efforts look like and have real conversations about that in advance to get a sense of what the other side is thinking. Are there examples of what they've done for others before that they can show you? And then can you use some of that to help negotiate for yourself? And some of this is research, right? Like research what they've done, what partnerships they've had, and was it a silly tweet that they did for that person and you didn't see it again? Or did they actually do something more and you should try to get that more for yourself?
I love it. And we do have one more question following that. Here's a scenario. Artists lending an image to a nonprofit organization for a fundraiser, artwork or quote on t-shirts and tote bags. Would a non-exclusive contract with a time range edition limit be appropriate?
Yeah, so the first part of that, I think a non-exclusive contract would be appropriate, unless, so I'm looking, there's a quote on t-shirts and tote bags, unless they were looking to use that image as part of their permanent branding, which might be a different conversation. Then you might be talking about an exclusive license. But I think if it's kind of like for their swag bag for promo, then I think you could offer a non-exclusive license. In terms of the time range or edition limit, I think edition limit might make more sense. For time range, it's going to be hard because once the t-shirts are made and the tote bags are out in the world, they can't pull them back, right? So they might be, I think it probably might make more sense to have an edition limit on the number of t-shirts, maybe the number of tote bags, as opposed to thinking about timing in that scenario. But I think it's definitely, fair to try to get a non-exclusive agreement in that case.
And just to emphasize something that you were referencing before, it might, because you kept saying silly tweet, and that stuck with me. It might seem a little uncomfortable or silly to talk about some of these things, but don't you think it kind of sets up the framework for the parties to have a better relationship throughout the working process if everything is laid out, in black and white on paper? Hey, this is what you got to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And these should be conversations, right? Like we should be having conversations. What are you hoping? What are you thinking? What does this look like for you? What is your plan? What is your vision? These can be like the type of conversations you want to have with a partner. It doesn't have to be sort of, give me this information. You know what I mean? Like the way you approach it doesn't have to be so hard nosed, but I really think it needs to be a conversation so everyone's on the same page about what they're talking about, and then drill that down into specifics. It's always good to get surety up front, because what happens in these things is that there's a lot of excitement in the beginning, but you want to make sure that excitement lives for the term of the relationship, and you don't know where things are going to go. So it's better to have that kind of drilled down in advance.
I think that's a perfect segue into the next part of your presentation. Thank you so much.
Okay, sounds good. Now we get into the meat of what is negotiation. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, and if you go back for a second, do you want to linger on this for 1 minute? So negotiation is a discussion aimed at reaching an agreement. And I think that's important. I wanted to kind of come back to the slide and not skip over it, because I think it's important to keep that in mind, that the goal on both sides is to reach an agreement. So everyone is sort of, even if you have different goals about what that agreement looks like, the goal is still to come to an agreement. So if we go to the next slide, what are these key stages of an agreement? So, or of the negotiation. And I like to think of it as the preparation, which is some of what I've been trying to talk about in the first part of this presentation, which I'd like you guys to do, is to think about all of what we talked about in the first part of what we're looking for, what we're willing to give up, what is our work, all of that. What's a nice to have, what's a must have. Also, when we're talking about preparation, understanding the other side, I think, is critical. So we're going through the Q&A. We spoke a little bit about, trying to get a sense of what the other side is thinking. Have they done something like this in the past that you can look to as an example of what they could do for you? But do some negotiation. Do some research. I think of it as like, I wouldn't go on a date with someone who I didn't know without at least Googling them first. So Google the other side first. And then understand, the power that you have. And I think it's important to keep in mind that you probably have more power than you think you do. And I think it's really important to go into every negotiation with that in mind. Don't always assume that you're kind of on the downside of the power dynamic. And then the middle stage is obviously the bargaining. This is where we're going back and forth. And you really want to have, the preparation is key for that, because you really want to have well thought out arguments about why what you're offering is appropriate, whether that's market, whether that's what they've done before, whether that's what the work's value commands. You want to have supporting evidence, and then be willing to make some reasonable concessions. When I do negotiations, there's a bucket of things I know we don't care that much about, and so that we're willing to give up. We'll give those up, though, only as a trade for something else. So I would definitely want to keep that in mind, that, have your reasonable concessions, have that kind of stowed away as part of your negotiation. And then either close or walk away. Understand when you have, in real estate, they call it the best and final offer. This is sort of like you've hit the wall. You've hit the wall on what you're willing to give and what the other side is willing to give. And understand if you can take that offer or whether you need to walk away. And we'll talk about this, but it's critical always to have a plan B. Have something else you can fall back on, ideally. And even if that, when I say plan B, it doesn't mean like, oh, there's another deal waiting, necessarily another person or partner waiting in the background, but just because you've planned and have sort of a strategy for where you're going, even if you don't have an exact plan B, the plan B is that you know what you need to do for another alternative. I'd like to think of it that way. So if we go to the next slide, I'll go into more detail on preparation. So just know what you're getting into, all right? Like I said, you want to gather information as much as possible. Understand your leverage. Has anyone else has worked with this person before or worked with this party before? Can you get any information about how they tend to address any issues, or how they tend to go into a negotiation, what they're willing to give on, what's important to them? So that you can use that information to help you with your own negotiation. Build a relationship. I think it's really important. Some of what we were talking about in the Q&A again is understanding where both sides are. So the more you can have conversations, get to know the other side, some of the softer relationship building first, I think that will give you some of the information you need to walk into that bargaining phase well armed. Know your objectives. So for your strategy, how does this fit in? Is this, purely money? Is this an opportunity for a better platform? Is this an opportunity to get in front of a certain type of audience? So what is the thing that this is going to give you? What are you hoping to get out of it? And always keep that at the forefront. And then determine what your negotiation strategy is going to be, which we'll get into in a second. So if we go to the next slide, one way to think about negotiation strategy is to understand your BATNA. A BATNA is your best alternative to the negotiated agreement. This is what you would do if the deal fell through. Do you have a good alternative? If you know you have a good alternative, then you don't need to concede as much, because it won't be as big of a hurt if you don't get the deal. If your options are slim, or on the other side, then the other person can continue to make demands, and you'll be forced to accept them. So just to kind of understand what your alternatives are, and maybe think about trying to source some of those alternatives yourself, right? And we see this happening in the community all the time, because there are so many digital platforms now that going with a bigger player gives a lot of finances and structure and opportunity. And I'm talking across multiple genres here, but there are so many direct-to-consumer platforms that some artists will say, well, can I do this myself? Can I promote this myself? Can I distribute this myself? Can I get this out on a platform myself? Can I achieve whatever my objective is? Do I have other resources that I can do that? But think about, do I have the time? Do I have the expertise? Is that really how I want to spend my time? Go through all of that in advance and understand, look, if this deal falls through, am I willing to, do I have the ability to do it myself? Or is there someone else out there I think I can go to and I can kind of achieve the same goal? So I always say, go into every negotiation, understanding what your BATNA is. So if we go to the next slide, ultimately it's accept or walk away. If the agreement is better than your alternative, then you should accept it. If the agreement is not better than what your BATNA is, then you should either walk away or continue to negotiate. But you need to know what that threshold is. So if you go into a negotiation unprepared, if you don't know what your alternatives are, at what point you're willing to walk away, then you'll likely accept deals or terms that won't work for you, or you'll accept them but without any reasoning. And I think it's really important to have a reason why you're willing or able to accept something. So just keep in mind, when you're negotiating, is this better or worse than what the alternative would be? And use that to determine whether you're going to accept, walk away, or keep negotiating. If we go to the next slide, another kind of data point to think about in terms of negotiations is your reservation value. And you want to know yours and the reservation value for the other side. And this is the least favorable point at which someone will accept the agreement. This is your bare minimum of, I'd love to get 10 more things, but I guess if I can only get this is still acceptable. This isn't exactly what I wanted, but it has the bare minimum of what I want. So it's important to have that for yourself, but it's also important to have that try to get that information from the person that you're negotiating with, so that you know where their point is as well. And again, it's hard to know that, but I think doing some research, either on your own, trying to talk to other people, talk to the other side themselves, getting a sense about what's important, and trying to get to at least an estimate of where you think the minimum that they're willing to accept is, will help you in your negotiations as well. If we go to the next slide, we can see how this kind of all fits in together. So if you look at your reservation value, and if you look at the other side's reservation value, in between that is the zone of possible agreement, right? So that's the range in which you can probably reach an agreement that's going to be satisfactory to both parties involved. It won't be beyond one person's sort of bare minimum or beyond the other person's bare minimum. It'll be right in the middle. So that's why I said it's important to both know yours and the other side's reservation value, if possible, so you can kind of know where you are in between. Now, obviously, the goal isn't to be so far to one side or the other so that someone's only getting the bare minimum of what they're willing to agree to. Ideally, you get more, but this will just sort of help you understand where some of those guardrails lie. So if we go to the next slide, this is just an example, potentially for negotiating gallery representation. Again, a multitude of agreements or situations you might be negotiating for, just using this as an example. These are some questions that you want to have answers to. So solo show or group show? Do I need to create a new work? And again, I'm not going to go through all of these questions, but these are questions I would ask you to have, whether it is a gallery representation or it's something else, have these questions posed to yourself. Know what you want your answers to be. That way, when you go in to talk to the other side, you get a sense of how close or far apart. Things that you might not think about, like framing or shipping pieces, marketing, which we talked about before. What happens if you sell a piece separately from the gallery? Like, what do they have rights to versus what you can do on your own? Understanding the look and the layout of the show and how much control you'll have over how work is displayed. I think there's some of the big ticket, money and ownership, et cetera, but then there's some smaller questions, but that will have a big impact on, potentially for long-term for your career. And then also some of the details, like who insures work, what happens if art is damaged in transit. These are details that's important to have worked out to the extent possible in advance. So what I like to do sometimes in these situations is to spin out every possible scenario just so I can go through for myself and think about, okay, what haven't we covered off? Because an agreement is ultimately a piece of paper, but it really needs to govern all the things that can happen in a relationship as much as possible. And so the more you can kind of get that out, I think, in advance, the better. If we go to the next slide, and I apologize, if there are questions, definitely drop them in the chat, because I understand everyone is going to have different scenarios that they're dealing with. So I'm giving you some questions for gallery representations. This slide has questions for negotiating licensing agreements, but obviously everyone's going to have their own situations they're negotiating. So if we can get to some of those questions, we will, but I just want to give you some examples of questions that you could look for in a specific scenario. So if we put up the negotiating licensing agreement slide, these are the questions that you want to have answered here. Some of them we already talked about the rights, but think about things like, is sub-licensing allowed? So if you're allowing someone to use your work, can they monetize that as well? Can they allow someone else to use it? Making sure you know who owns the work. If it's royalties, how is it going to be paid? Thinking about length. Again, these are just questions to kind of spin up for yourself as part of this negotiation strategy. So if we go to the next slide, this is what I think is critical for us to understand. Do not bargain yourself down before you get to the table. We're talking about preparation. I think preparation is important here, but also keep your value in mind. So don't go through these questions and think, oh, well, I probably can't get this. I want to make sure I get that, but that probably won't happen. Like that kind of conversation with yourself, I think, sets yourself up not to get the things that you want. So if we're going into this, think about the best possible outcome that you want for yourself, with a dose of realism, obviously, but think about the best possible outcome you want for yourself, and use your preparation to try to get to that point, not to try to say, this probably won't happen, or I shouldn't even bother asking for this. So I always have to put that out there. So let's go to the next slide. We can talk about bargaining. When you get to that middle phase, you're now in the bargaining stage. You want to make sure that you don't concede without getting something in return. So I'll give up this, but are you also willing to do this for me? I can accept this that you've offered me, but can you agree then to do something else? So have those things in mind of what you want to ask for, what you can concede, but what you want to ask for in return. And then determine, where you can be flexible and when you can kind of give on something in order to get something back. And that's what I talked about in the beginning, kind of having that bucket of things that maybe you probably just don't care about that much. So there are concessions you'll be willing to give, but make sure you're getting something back in exchange for them. If we go to the next slide, these are really the key negotiation outcomes. The ideal is number one, right? We're in a win-win. Every party has achieved their goals. Within the confines of their bargaining process, everyone walks away feeling great. The 4 is the exact opposite. Everyone walks away with a loss. No one's happy. And then you have something in the middle, right? One side feels like it's a loss. The other side doesn't. You always want to get to a win-win. And, this seems probably complicated, but we've been negotiating, at least I think I've been negotiating since I was a kid. And I like to give the example of probably my best and most successful negotiation as a child. was when I came home very excited. It was around Halloween time, and I told my mom we were going to be bobbing for apples the next day. And she said, absolutely not. I mean, in hindsight, the concept of bobbing for apples seems kind of disgusting, and particularly the pandemic, but we'll put that aside. She did not want me to go bobbing for apples. She said, I had to sit this one out. But I asked her why. Why can't I do this? And she said, because it's disgusting and they're germs and all these kids will be putting their mouths in the bucket bobbing for apples, and I don't want you to do that. So next day I come home from school. She asked how my day was, and I said it was great. I went bobbing for apples. And she's furious. I told you not to go bobbing for apples. I told you, you'd have all these germs. Why didn't you listen to me? And I said, I did. I went first. I got myself in line. I understood that her issue wasn't me bobbing for apples. It was that she didn't want me to get the germs from the other kids bobbing for apples. So I made sure I was first in line so I would avoid those germs. I still got to bob for apples, and it was a win-win. So that's a silly example, but you always want to get to a place where it's a win-win. What does the other side want? Can you get them what you want while still getting the thing that you want? So if we go to the next slide, and again, these are some tools I want to give in terms of thinking about bargaining. So how do you get to that win-win? Well, the first is identify the interests. That's why when I was told, don't go bobbing for apples, my first question was, well, why can't I go bobbing for apples? So the why do you want that? If you're being presented with terms that you don't like or don't work for you or that you think are too onerous, well, what are you trying to get here? A phrase I often use in negotiations, well, what are we trying to accomplish? Or what are you trying to accomplish? What are your concerns? What are you trying to caution against? And how can I give you comfort without going as far as the thing that you're asking for? Understand how your demands are being perceived. So what is standing in the way of them agreeing? If you're asking for something and you're getting a no, well, what is it? What's the concern? How can we get past this? And, I use we language a lot because, as I said in the beginning of this section, the goal is to get to an agreement. So we should be talking about we. How can we do this? How can we achieve this? How can we get to a place where we can agree? This shouldn't be sort of too confrontational or too opposing, because the goal is that we're trying to build something together. So understand what's standing in the way of getting both sides to the same place. And then what are the consequences? There are always potential for things to be in the background that you don't understand, pressures that the other side might be facing or other deals that they have that they need to be thinking about. But it's important to try to get to that. So this is more of sort of an empathetic, way to approach things. And it builds off of having a relationship and understanding of what both sides want so that you can get to a place for a win-win. And I like this kind of integrative bargaining more than anything because first, I think it helps you go into a relationship with a lot more information. So when you get past this bargaining stage and hopefully you do get to a win-win, you agree, you don't have people walking away, but you understand more about the other side. And I think that helps facilitate your business partnership down the line. So there are benefits beyond just the deal, I think, from this approach of having a conversation, trying to understand the pressures, trying to understand the friction as to, for what you're asking for and why it's being blocked. I think that's a great way to sort of build a foundation in addition to getting to your result. So if we go to the next slide, I'll give some more specific tactics. And this is some of what I was just talking about, like setting, a trusting, cooperative tone, right? You want to have a mutual benefit. You want to have a long-term relationship. You want to build something with this person. These are some of the softer sides of these conversations that I think don't get focused on. You want to talk about teamwork, focus on why, not the what. The conversations tend to get bogged down in the what do you need me to deliver? What is the money? What are the rights? The what of the deal. But if you take a step back and talk about the why, I think that helps both parties maybe put something into context. Well, why are we here? What are we trying to achieve? And maybe there's a way we can reach that goal if we focus on that why a little bit more than the what. You have to get to the what because we want things to be concrete and specific, but that big picture conversation I think is helpful for setting some context. And then, increase the number of issues that you can negotiate. This is really important. You increase your chances for a win-win outcome by increasing the number of matters you can resolve. So it looks as if everyone's getting something of value. That's why I said have those things that you're willing to concede on. So you can kind of have more gives. Oh, okay. Like I do a lot of these agreements, and we have red line documents going back and forth. And the feeling of seeing the red start to melt away and issues start to get resolved and things start to get accepted, you feel like you're building towards an end, right? So if you start off with a number of points to talk about, but you can slowly narrow those down, it helps both parties feel, and again, some of this is just psychological, it helps both parties feel like you're actually getting to a resolution. So these are just some strategies and tactics. If we go to the next slide, I think it's important to avoid ultimatums. Like if you just want to say, look, this is it, take it or leave it, it just sort of limits your options. That would create a win-lose scenario. So even if you got what you want, the other side wouldn't be happy with it. And because a lot of this world is relationship based, you might get what you wanted in the short term, but you might have damaged a relationship in the long term. So trying to avoid taking that kind of hard edge on some of these conversations. Give to get. If you give, the more I see something come back and the other side has agreed, and the more I'm willing to say, look, they gave on this, so at least like we can give on these points and we can slowly again get ourselves into an agreement. And these smaller compromises, I think, end up being, less threatening and easier to obtain. So think about this as sort of like breaking off tiny little pieces of a big chunk before you get, as opposed to just tackling the big chunk of it itself. So if there is a big topic or a big piece of an agreement or a partnership that you're negotiating, can you break it down into smaller pieces and try to work on those smaller pieces as opposed to dealing with the whole? And that works even if we're talking about compensation, because you can break compensation down to, okay, well, you have the number, but how is it getting paid? Can you add, something on top of that? Can you add royalties that might give a bump to that? Can you add a performance benchmark that gives a bump that might get you to a number? So you can start with a lower number, but end up potentially with a higher number. Are there, issues around terms? Just, again, think about breaking these big topics down into their smaller pieces, and that will help you, gradually get to a place of agreement. And of course, I'm a lawyer, I have to say this, document all of it. I started this off saying that I hope everyone's dealing with agreements, but I understand that might not always be the case. I mean, even if we're talking about, a bulleted list, you want to document as much as possible, because you don't want to go back later, having put a lot of work in, come to a great resolution and not have it actually documented in a way that it can be enforced later. And, if you're dealing with someone that has selective memory, it's always beneficial to have things kind of written down in an agreement. So I cannot emphasize that more. So if we go to the next slide, we could talk about hardball. You might be taking an integrative approach and want to be very collaborative, and the other side might be playing hardball. So how do you deal with hardball? You want to spot these tactics and try to diffuse them if possible. And here's some of what that looks like. So it could be, oh, well, my hands are tied. I work with a lot of corporations. And so I've heard some companies say, well, we went to the board and they said no. It's like, no, you didn't go to the board. Or I went up to the top and we couldn't get this deal done, and we couldn't, we weren't able to get permission to do this. And I always give a question mark to that. Did you really run it up as much as you said that you did? Or that take it or leave it negotiation strategy, trying to make you flinch, personal insults. Look, this is the best. You're not going to get any better deal than this. I don't know where you think you are in the industry, but you're crazy if you think you're going to be able to get these asks. I think it's important to kind of identify and spot these tactics of hardball and try to diffuse them. And by diffuse them, I mean, not react to them and kind of come back to some of the other strategies that we're talking about. It's almost like, sticking a hole in a balloon. You want to be able to pop that balloon, take the hot air out of it essentially, and get back to what's important. And so when someone's coming at like a very aggressive kind of posture, I take a very calm posture, which I find makes them frustrated, but kind of diffuses some of that kind of hot air and consternation if that's what you're getting. And then also I would say, if you're seeing too many hardball tactics, think about whether or not this is actually a party that you want to deal with at all. Or is this a situation where this is going to be a difficult partnership down the line? Spot these tactics and figure out, is this something I'm willing to go forward with, or should I actually just try to find someone else to work with who's going to be a better partner in this situation with me? So we can go to the next slide. Words of wisdom: always be closing. The goal is to get a deal. If there's not going to be a deal, walk away and move on to something else. But, always be closing. So I think I'm going to take a break here and see if there are questions. And then we have a couple of case studies to walk through.
Okay. So the first question we have, Jessica, is, are apps copyrighted? Or I guess phrased another way, can you get a copyright on an app?
You can get a copyright for the pages within an app, almost like a website. Like a website, you can get copyrighted. You can get the text and the images and all of that copyrighted. So the contents of that app can be copyrighted, and then the name of the app would likely be trademarked, right? So there are different pieces of intellectual property that would be attached to the app.
Right. So what you're saying is you can't look at the app as a whole as being copyrighted, but just within that, little bits and pieces have various intellectual property rights associated with them.
Right. Exactly. So like the contents of the app can be copyrighted. The name of the app would likely be trademarked. But it's not like you would submit an app itself for copyright protection. It's like the pieces of the app that you submit.
Right. And to your point, when you say the content, some of that may also be like the actual visual layout of the content as well, correct?
Exactly. And but you have to kind of peel that out, because do you own all of the images in that app, or does someone else own it? That's why you can't say the whole app is copyrighted. It's the pieces inside of it. What did you create? The written text, the visuals, the layout, all of that. And then what did you license from someone else? Because that's typically how the app gets built.
Perfect. Love it. So we have another question here, which is, and I'll try to rephrase it, can you set up recurring payments or fees to go directly to your bank account? I guess to add on top of that, when is an appropriate situation where that might be a good thing to do?
Yeah, I think if that's a situation in your payment structure, so you're getting paid whether they're royalties or some other recurring payment, then I think it does make sense to get those fees directly into your bank account, as opposed to getting them in a check or some other form. But some of that's going to depend on who you're working with and what their kind of payment system looks like.
Okay, great. And then, can the architecture of the app be patented, though? And this is, like you were saying before, peeling away the different pieces. But how do you answer the patent part of that question?
So whether or not it can be patented will depend. So when you say architecture, if you're talking about the layout probably can't be. But if the app does something, it performs a function, it has a service, maybe there's, artificial intelligence built into whatever the app does, that might have a possibility to get a patent attached to it. So part of it depends on what you mean about the architecture. Like layout, no. But if it's actually an invention in terms of like the service that the app is creating, that has some potential for being patented.
Okay, wonderful. I think we're ready to go on to the next part of your presentation. This is the interactive portion of it.
Yes. So we're going to have a conversation about two case studies. One is, we'll call it a promising, and we want to use this as an opportunity to put our negotiation tactics into action. So the first is a promising young photographer. It's a recent graduate of a visual arts school, promising young careers, and talks with a well-known New York gallery for her first art show. The gallery offers a 50-50 profit split, but requires that the artist print all the work on aluminum and pay for that herself. The photographer can't afford the production cost, but doesn't want to pass up the opportunity to have her first show with the gallery. So you can see the prompt here. I'm going to act as the photographer, right? So I'm in the position where I'm excited for this opportunity. I really want to work with this gallery, but I know I can't pay to have the aluminum printed. So where I'm sitting, I'm trying to find out, well, first, why? Why does it need to be printed on aluminum? Will the gallery be willing to take some of that cost for me? Or can I meet some performance benchmarks in terms of sales at the gallery show? Could that go towards having them front the cost of having the aluminum paid? But we want to hear from you all. How would you negotiate as the gallery owner, hearing my side of the story? And Jeff.
So I'll play the gallery owner just to start a little bit. Listen, you're a young artist. This is the way my gallery has always done things. It's the way the market works in the city. And if you don't like it, then it's something you're going to have to get used to.
Well, and I appreciate that. I think it's a great opportunity, though, for us to be able to work together. You know, I've talked to some other gallerists and some of my other colleagues who have had different experience with different gallerists. So I know that there are others out there who have been more willing to at least work with someone like me. Keep in mind, I'm just coming out of school, so I don't have a lot of money, but I do have a lot of promise. You can tell from the school I graduated from, you know, most of my colleagues have gone on to great success. So I think this would be a great opportunity for you to kind of get the first door in to work with me. And we just have to figure out this small issue of payment. And I appreciate the 50-50 split. Would you be willing to at least take some of that split to apply it towards the payment for the materials? Or would you be willing to front it and maybe use that if I reach a certain number of sales, we can use that to apply to pay you back for having fronted me the money for getting this printing done?
I appreciate your moxie and your response in coming back to me. I think there's something we can work it out here. Maybe we can take a chunk of it out of the profit and maybe go on that way.
Great.
Good negotiations.
Yeah. So I don't know if everything's going to be that simple, but, you know, I think where I am looking at the comments, I do see some great suggestions. I really like this one, working together to find a partner or sponsor to help underwrite the cost. I think particularly today, you know, you'll find more companies willing to do that kind of sponsorship, and find a third party that's willing to come in is a great idea. Yeah. And the in-kind workshops, I think that is great as well. Great. We got some really good suggestions in here.
Some really good stuff. So, and I think, you know, another thing to do is maybe you'd agree with this, read some historical works. Because, I mean, for example, museums often have the gallerist or underwrite the cost of production themselves. So taking strategies of bigger companies and applying it to yourself as an individual artist may be a way to go as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we have one more case study, I believe.
Yes, we can go to the next slide after this. Okay, so the next one is we've spent all of that time on licensing, so we're going to have the opportunity now to talk about licensing. But we're talking about a graphic artist with a big social media presence and a popular website receives an inquiry for a greeting card company looking for an exclusive license to her work. She licenses her work through her website and some third-party sites, but this would obviously be a much more lucrative opportunity. So in this scenario, want to get to the question is going to be about around this exclusive license. So I'm going to act as a graphic artist. I'm really excited for this opportunity. I would love I should have said you should put in the comments how you would negotiate as a licensing company kind of hearing me. But as a graphic artist, I'm really excited for this opportunity. A big fan of this greeting card company. I would love to have my work here. If we're talking about an exclusive license, are you looking for a license to all of my work, or am I able to give you a subset of my existing work that can be used on the greeting cards? Are you opening to narrowing the scope of that exclusive license?
Well, we'd love to have you as far as the greeting cards. The exclusive nature is important because we need to develop the brand behind these particular line of cards. People may very well like them. We want to produce more. So when you say subset, how big of a subset were you thinking?
Sure. So I have about 100 images on my site right now, but I think that there are 20 to 30 that are great quality that would fit with your brand, and so I'd be willing to give you that subset for this project. And like I said, I'm identifying them because I think they're the works that would fit best with what you're looking to do.
Okay, 20 to 30 sounds good. I think we can make that work.
That sounds great to me. I look forward to working with you.
Yes. And I don't have the comments in front of me. I think you may have some other suggestions, or no?
Let's see. I'm looking in the comments. I don't see other suggestions for this one, but I do think that we got some good responses here. And, we just want to go through this quickly as an example. If we go to the next slide, I think we can show the slide after that. Because as we wrap up, I just wanted to give some tips for.
Jessica, are you there?
No, she's not.
Okay. So we've having some technical difficulties. We've lost Jessica momentarily. So she does have some tips on the screen. Are we waiting to have her back, or? Sure. So I can answer a question while we work on the technical issues. Can we begin with an exclusive license with a specific genre of my work? So when it comes to contracts and negotiating, you can get pretty creative with the language and what you put into a contract. The issue when you start getting into genres of work is you're going to want to define what a genre encompasses, right? So for example, if a subset of your work is sci-fi based, well, what elements are part of the sci-fi work that maybe wouldn't be in the steampunk part of it? Do they overlap? Are they the same thing? So it can get a little complicated, but there's no reason you can't put forward the idea and try to work it out. But if you're going to get into defining by genre or bigger categories, you're just going to want to define it as best as you can, because where there's room for interpretation is where there's room really for the parties to kind of disagree once the contract is entered into and once you're getting forward. And that's where potential lawsuits or demand letters and just a breakdown of the relationship can occur. So you just want to be careful in doing it that way. Might they ask you, the graphic artist, to help use your social media presence to market the cards? That is certainly something that they could ask. As Jessica was referring to earlier in the presentation, the two parties are going to want to market it themselves. And in 2021, we have all the social media. You have Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram. So you can absolutely negotiate to help each other, boost each other. My understanding is we have Jessica back. Hi, Jessica. Jessica, can you hear us?
Yep, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, great.
Sorry about that.
Not a problem. Feel free to continue where you left off.
Okay. We'll be back live and everything will be better hopefully next year. But anyway, I wanted to cover some tips to go home with. Don't be afraid to ask for what you want. I think that's just critical. I mean, even in these, negotiations, these sample negotiations we had, you heard, I don't want to give up, if I'm the graphic artist, my full catalog. I want to give up a smaller part of it. So, ask for what you want. Keep the 70-30 rule in mind in terms of listening. So listen 70% of the time and only talk 30% of the time. I find that if you let someone talk, you hear what's important to them, and then you can use some of that in your conversations. So as you know, if you're asking those why questions, you can start to hear from the other side what's really important, what they're trying to get at, and maybe you can find out an angle in to get to that win-win. You know, we talked about prepare, be willing to walk away if you have to. Try to think of, again, if it's not a specific alternative, at least a strategy for what an alternative could be. So if this opportunity doesn't work out, you know, how can I make sure I can move in a way where I'll have a similar strategy, a similar option shortly down the line. You know, always aim high and be willing to settle for something less if you have to. Show the other side, the other person, that their needs are going to be met. Even when we're having the conversation as the gallerist and the photographer, you know, the money would end up being the same, right? If we're pulling from profits in order to get this material paid for, you're not necessarily losing out. But you would potentially be losing the opportunity to work with an up and coming, very promising, you know, at least I like to say to myself, photographer. So, you know, just try to having some of that conversation. You know, don't give anything away without getting something in return. It should not always be give without seeing anything coming back to you. So if you're giving up a point, always have a corresponding ask to go for that. And then ultimately, don't take any of this personally. You know, it's hard to say that because this is your work, and it is much more personal to you than, like, say, corporate business negotiations. But it is business, and nothing that happens should be necessarily like a reflection of you and your work. You know, it's a reflection of the business and the circumstances, and I think that will help create some resiliency so that, you know, if things don't work out, again, we always hope to get to that win-win and to be closing. But if they don't, you can move on to the next deal, but take, you know, still be empowered to go into those negotiations with confidence. So it sounded like I missed some questions. If there are more questions, happy to take those in the time we have left.
Okay, so as far as not taking it personally, I mean, they say it's business, right? So what are some strategies maybe you can provide to creators who are emotionally tied to their work, understandably so, how to approach these negotiations, almost separating themselves from the underlying art and more so just like on the economic side of things or just the marketing side of things for their career?
Right. And I'll answer that question, but I'll give the caveat that it's easier said than done because I know a lot of creatives. I work with a lot of creatives. And so I understand sort of the emotional connection to the work. And so I'll say this, understanding that I know it's going to be very hard to put into practice. But I do think if you can create, you know, some separation and even some of that preparation when we talked about what are my long-term strategies, pull myself away from this specific project, but what are my long-term goals for my career, where I want my practice to go, where I want my work to go, big picture, my portfolio of work, not just this specific piece. And then what are the business, you know, kind of terms I need to negotiate for myself to make that happen. If you can pull yourself up from the exact work in front of you, I think that might be helpful in creating some space. And then again, focusing on what you want in terms of, you know, the fees or the term or what you're looking for this particular deal, like focusing on the specific business terms as opposed to the piece of work might also create some space between you and what's going to be very, very personal to you.
And just to build off of that, I mean, I'm sure a lot of your practice and so for me as well is don't be afraid to speak with people who aren't yourself, right? You don't have to handle it on your own. You can talk about it with mentors, with friends, family, attorneys. There are ways to try to, you know, disengage yourself from the emotional side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, and you want to talk to, I mean, you want to talk to as many people as possible, right? If you know someone who knows someone, that's always the best, right? Like, yeah. What terms did they get? What did their deal look like? Is this person always like this? For me, I know if I know someone's always like this and like this probably means something negative about the person.
Yeah.
Not personal, right? It's not about me. That's just who that person is, and I can put that aside and move on. So I think that is all helpful to help you figure out, am I being treated unfairly?
Wonderful. I think we have a couple questions. I'm being approached to illustrate a children's book by author that is writing their first book. My first try at illustration. I see at minimum illustrators get $5,000. Author will not pay this money. Suggestions?
Interesting. So, I mean, first I try to figure out, well, what are they willing to pay, right? If they're not willing to pay the 5,000, is their number 1,000? Is it like extremely far off from the number that you're looking for, or is it someplace, or is it closer? Maybe try to figure out what are the author's circumstances. Is it that they don't want to pay the 5,000, or is it that they can't pay the 5,000? And then if you want to get to that number, are there other ways that you can get there? So can it be whatever they're willing to pay up front, and then some portion of it taken out of the sales down the line? That might be a better way. That might be a way to structure it so that if the author's concern is not having the funds now, again, not knowing who the author is, but if they don't have the funds now, maybe you can have a piece of the sales, and that will help you get to that number. So,
right.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go please.
And I was going to say, that goes back to the why, figuring out, well, what's stopping them? Why aren't they willing to pay that 5,000? And where are they starting from? What number are they starting from?
Great advice. We have, this is just a comment, some combination of payments over time, which is something you were referring to. Maybe something else to consider is, how much illustration you want to work in, right? I mean, is this your entryway into the industry? Are you willing to accept a lower payment because of that? Do you maybe see a future working with this author if they write more books? So exactly like Jessica's saying, it's all about, analyzing what does it mean for you going forward? What's the success look like for you at this time and long term? What about the issue of the time it takes to go back and forth and negotiate? Oh, the glories of negotiations.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I think you have to factor in. How much time are you willing to spend? How important is this to you? And you reach a point where, I've done deals that have lasted over a year, right? Like that probably is like not an untenable period of time for some people. And it really just depends on what you're talking about. So I think that also goes into having your strategy. How much time are you willing to invest? How important is this? If it's really important, this is going to be the critical thing that gets you where you want to go, then I think it's worth spending the time to do the negotiations. If it's not that, and so there's no strategic value and maybe no corresponding monetary value, then maybe it's not worth the time if you feel like it's going to be some prolonged negotiation.
Wonderful. All right. I think that's all the questions for today. Jessica, thank you so much for joining us today. You've done a wonderful job. I know I enjoyed it. How can people watching today find you or just read up about your practice?
Sure. You can find me, my law firm. I'm a partner at Loeb and Loeb. So you can find me on Loeb and Loeb's site. But you can also find me on Twitter at lawgirl821.
All right. Thank you so much for today. Always a pleasure to speak with fellow art attorneys. I'm sure we can nerd out over this stuff for hours.
Oh, yes, definitely. And this is a great group with great questions. So thanks, everyone, for coming today. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks so much, Jessica. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us for the Business Skills for Creatives, the Art of Negotiation. This is the last of this particular session in English. We will be having, when I say we, the Broward Cultural Division will be having a session in Spanish entitled, I want to get this right, Emprendimiento Creativo. Close enough, which will be entirely in Spanish on August 21st. So be sure to follow the Broward Cultural Division if you are interested in watching that session as well. As another reminder, the Cultural Division provides grant money to individual artists of all disciplines through its artist support grant. The deadline is September 17th. So you got about a month and a half left. You're going to want to look into that if that's something you're interested in. We have it on the screen. We have workshops August 11th, 10:30 a.m. and 5:30 p.m. on how to apply for those grants. Definitely worth looking at. I know I've watched that myself. They're always great presentations. And also Thursday this coming week, August 5th at 6 p.m., the Cultural Division will be hosting a live Q&A on Instagram. So make sure to follow at Broward Arts on Instagram so you can get that mini session as well. For more opportunities, do not forget to visit artscalendar.com for artist opportunities and events in South Florida. I'm a partner. I'm the director of art and business law, Josh Lita, with Twig Trade and Tribunal PLLC down here in Fort Lauderdale. You can find us at twiglaw.com. You can find me on Twitter. A lot of stuff about non-fungible tokens and NFTs lately. If you follow me there, you can go to ESQLIDA. That's ESQLIDA at Twitter. And for our local viewers, just a reminder that it's everyone's favorite part of the month, Art Walk in downtown Fort Lauderdale. We have Fat Village and the Mass District. It's open. It's free to the public, 6 to 10. It's such a fun time. Local vendors, local artists. You get to just commune with the local community and build up the art, cultural elements of Fort Lauderdale. So thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you for the Spanish edition on August 21st. Have a great day.